At my husband's funeral, his mistress smirked, until I handed her the letter he left for me. I never imagined that the worst day of my life would also become the day I finally found my strength. My name is Margaret, and I'm 55 years old. After 30 years of marriage, I thought I knew everything about my husband Richard. I was wrong about so many things, but I was right about one crucial detail. He was a coward who would rather hurt everyone around him than face his own failures. The morning of Richard's funeral dawned gray and cold, matching the emptiness in my chest. For 8 months, I had watched cancer slowly steal the man I married, feeding him through tubes when his throat closed up, cleaning him when he couldn't make it to the bathroom, and holding his trembling hand through countless sleepless nights filled with pain and morphine-induced nightmares. I aged 10 years in those 8 months, my dark skin showing new lines of worry and exhaustion, my once vibrant spirit dimmed by grief and the crushing weight of caregiving. But Richard wasn't just my burden to bear, he was my companion, my partner, the father of our 2 beautiful children. At least, that's what I told myself every morning when I woke up to face another day of his illness. What I didn't tell myself, what I pushed deep down into the corners of my heart, was the truth I had discovered 3 years earlier. The truth about Sarah Martinez, a blonde real estate agent who had been sharing my husband's bed while I was sharing his burdens. Standing in my black dress that morning, adjusting my hat in the mirror for what felt like the 100th time, I caught sight of the sealed envelope on my dresser. Richard had given it to me 2 weeks before he died, his frail hand shaking as he pressed it into mine with more urgency than I had seen from him in months. "Margaret," he had whispered, his voice barely audible above the humming of the oxygen machine, "there's a woman who might come to my funeral. Blonde, about 40, drives a white BMW. Her name is Sarah. If she comes, and if she speaks to you, and she will speak to you, give her this letter. Promise me you'll give it to her exactly as I wrote it." I had promised, though every fiber of my being screamed against it. I knew who Sarah was. I had known for 3 years, ever since I found the credit card statements showing expensive dinners for 2 at restaurants Richard claimed he'd never been to, on nights when he told me he was working late at the office. I knew about the hotel receipts tucked away in his briefcase, the jewelry purchases that never made it to me, and the phone calls that stopped abruptly when I entered the room, followed by hurried explanations about work emergencies that required him to step outside. The signs had been there for months before I found concrete proof, but I had chosen to ignore them because acknowledging them would have meant acknowledging that my marriage was built on lies. Richard had become distant, critical of everything I did, constantly finding fault with my cooking, my appearance, my conversation. He started coming home late more frequently, always with elaborate explanations about client dinners or overtime projects that couldn't wait until morning. When I finally decided to investigate, it took me less than a week to uncover the full extent of his betrayal. Sarah Martinez, successful real estate agent, divorced, no children, living in a luxury condo downtown that Richard had helped her buy. They had been together for over 2 years by the time I discovered their relationship, meeting twice a week for lunch dates that turned into afternoon hotel visits, weekend business trips that were actually romantic getaways, and late-night phone calls that Richard took in his car in our own driveway. The funeral home was packed with Richard's colleagues, our neighbors, church members, and family friends who had come to pay their respects to a man they believed had been devoted to his family. Everyone kept telling me what a good man he was, how dedicated he had been to our marriage, how blessed I was to have had such a loving and faithful husband. Each compliment felt like a small knife twisting in my chest because I knew something they didn't. I smiled and nodded, accepting casseroles and condolences with the grace that had been drilled into me since childhood by a mother who believed that a woman's dignity was measured by how well she could suffer in silence. Mrs. Patterson from next door hugged me tightly and whispered, "You were so lucky to have a marriage like yours, Margaret. 30 years of pure devotion, that's rare these days." I thanked her and moved on to the next person in line, wondering what she would think if she knew that her definition of pure devotion included a 3-year affair with a woman young enough to be Richard's daughter. And then I saw her. She stood at the back of the room, partially hidden behind a large floral arrangement that had been sent by Richard's law firm. Blonde, early 40s, wearing a black dress that was too tight and too short for a funeral, but expensive enough to make a statement. She had positioned herself where she could see everything that was happening but remain relatively unnoticed by the crowd. But it wasn't her inappropriate attire or her strategic positioning that made my blood run cold. It was the smirk on her face as she watched me accept sympathy from Richard's business partner. Sarah Martinez had come, just as Richard predicted she would. And she was enjoying herself. Our eyes met across the crowded room, and instead of looking away in shame or grief, she lifted her chin defiantly. That smirk widened into something almost resembling a smile, and she had the audacity to raise her hand in a small wave, as if we were old friends meeting at a social gathering. She was proud of herself, proud of her place in Richard's life, proud that she had won something that she believed I had lost. I felt my hands begin to shake, not from grief this time, but from a rage I had suppressed for 3 long years. How dare she come here? How dare she smile at my husband's funeral while I stood there as his widow, having sacrificed everything to care for him in his final months? How dare she act as though she had any right to grieve for a man who had never belonged to her in any way that mattered? But I am Margaret Williams, daughter of Clara Williams, who raised 5 children alone during the civil rights era while working double shifts at the textile mill, granddaughter of Ruby Washington, who survived Jim Crow and still managed to start her own successful catering business that fed half the county. We Williams women don't break in public, and we don't give satisfaction to those who don't deserve it. So I straightened my shoulders, touched the envelope in my purse, and continued accepting condolences. But now I had a purpose beyond just getting through the day. Now I had a mission to complete, and for the first time in months, I felt something other than sadness and exhaustion. I felt anticipation mixed with a cold, calculated determination. The service itself was a blur of hymns and eulogies that painted Richard as a devoted family man and pillar of the community. Our daughter Jessica spoke beautifully about her father's dedication to family, sharing memories of bedtime stories and soccer games and father-daughter dances that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Our son Marcus shared memories of fishing trips and baseball games and the way Richard had taught him to change a tire and balance a checkbook, all the ordinary moments that make up the foundation of a father-son relationship. If they knew about Sarah, they gave no indication. They had loved their father completely, and I was grateful that his betrayal hadn't touched them the way it had slowly destroyed me over the past 3 years. They deserved to remember him as the father who had been there for them, not the husband who had failed me so completely. During the entire service, I could feel Sarah's eyes on me. She had moved closer, taking a seat 3 rows behind us where she could observe my every reaction, and I could sense her presence like a cold draft in a warm room. When the pastor spoke about the sanctity of marriage and how Richard and I had been blessed with 30 years of love and faithfulness, I heard a quiet, disdainful laugh from behind me. That laugh broke something inside me. Not my spirit, that had been broken long ago and slowly rebuilt into something harder and more resilient. It broke my last thread of patience, my final desire to protect everyone else's feelings above my own truth and dignity. Richard was gone, and his secrets were no longer mine to keep at the expense of my own self-respect. The pastor continued his eulogy, describing Richard as a man of integrity who had lived his life according to strong moral principles. Richard Williams was the kind of man who honored his commitments, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed funeral home. He understood that true love means showing up every day, through sickness and health, for better and for worse. Another soft laugh from behind me, and I felt my jaw clench with suppressed fury. Sarah was actually enjoying the irony of hearing her married lover praised for his faithfulness and commitment. The sheer audacity of her presence was breathtaking, but the fact that she found it amusing was unforgivable. After the cemetery service, back at the funeral home for the reception, I watched Sarah carefully position herself near the refreshment table where she could observe the crowd and wait for her opportunity. She seemed to be studying me, watching how I interacted with the guests, perhaps looking for signs of weakness or vulnerability that she could exploit. I was standing alone near the guest book, taking a moment to breathe and gather myself for whatever confrontation was coming, when I felt a presence beside me. Even before I turned, I knew it was her. She smelled like expensive perfume and ambition, a scent I had noticed on Richard's clothes more than once during the past few years. Mrs. Williams? Her voice was sugar-sweet with an underlying edge of satisfaction, like honey poured over broken glass. I'm so sorry for your loss. I turned to face her fully for the first time, and up close, she was prettier than I had expected, with carefully styled blonde hair and makeup applied with professional precision. She had the kind of artificial beauty that came from expensive treatments and designer clothes, the polished look of a woman who understood that her appearance was her primary asset and maintained it accordingly. "Thank you," I replied simply, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Richard was such a special man," she continued, and I could hear the emphasis she placed on the word special, as if it carried secret meaning that only she understood. "He meant so much to so many people. I'm sure you know how generous he could be with his time and attention." The audacity of this woman, standing in front of me at my husband's funeral, making veiled references to their affair while I was still wearing my mourning dress. If she expected me to break down or cause a scene, she was going to be sorely disappointed. "Yes, Richard was very generous," I agreed, pulling the envelope from my purse with deliberate slowness. "In fact, he was so generous that he left something specifically for you." Sarah's eyes immediately locked onto the envelope, and for the first time since I'd seen her, her confident composure slipped slightly. "For me?" she asked, trying to maintain her superior demeanor but unable to hide her surprise. "He made me promise to give this to you if you came to his funeral," I said, holding the envelope out between us like a weapon. "He was very specific about that. Said you'd probably come, and that you'd probably speak to me, and that when you did, I should give you this letter immediately." She took the envelope with hands that trembled slightly, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the paper as if it might disappear if she didn't hold it tightly enough. He mentioned me to you?" "Oh yes," I replied, my voice taking on a tone I had never used before, calm, controlled, and sharp as a surgical blade. "Richard mentioned you quite extensively in his final weeks. He had a lot to say about you, Sarah Martinez of Martinez Real Estate, who drives a white BMW and lives in the Pinnacle condominiums downtown." The specific details hit her like physical blows, and I watched her face pale beneath her carefully applied foundation. She hadn't expected me to know so much about her, hadn't realized that her secret affair had never been as secret as she believed. "I think you should read that letter now," I continued, gesturing toward the envelope in her hands. "Richard was very insistent that you receive it as soon as possible after his funeral. He spent quite a long time writing it, making sure every word was exactly what he wanted to say to you." Sarah looked around the room nervously, perhaps suddenly aware that we were in public, surrounded by people who had loved and respected my husband. The smirk was gone now, replaced by uncertainty and something that might have been fear. Maybe I should read this privately," she started to say, but I shook my head firmly. "No, I think here is perfect. Richard wanted you to have it today, and I promised him I would make sure you received it." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle between us. "Besides, I've been carrying this secret for him for 2 weeks now, and before that, I carried the secret of your affair for 3 years. I think I've earned the right to see his final message delivered." The room around us continued to buzz with quiet conversation, people sharing memories of Richard and offering comfort to one another. But in our small corner by the guest book, time seemed to slow down as Sarah stared at the envelope in her hands. She was trapped, and she knew it. She couldn't leave without reading the letter because her curiosity and ego were too strong, but she also couldn't predict what Richard might have written. For 3 years, she had held all the power in this twisted triangle. She was the excitement, the secret, the forbidden fruit that had drawn my husband away from his boring domestic obligations. Now, suddenly, she was the one in the dark while I held all the knowledge. Write in the comments below if you've ever had to carry someone else's secret that was slowly destroying you from the inside. Sometimes the heaviest burdens are the ones we never asked to carry. "Go ahead," I encouraged gently, my tone almost motherly. "Open it." With shaking fingers, Sarah tore open the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. I watched her face as she began to read, and I saw the exact moment when her world shifted. Her confident smirk disappeared first, replaced by confusion as she read the opening lines. Then her eyebrows furrowed as she continued, and her mouth opened slightly in shock. By the time she reached the middle of the letter, her face had gone completely pale beneath her expensive makeup. This can't be right," she whispered, her voice so quiet I almost couldn't hear her. "Keep reading," I suggested, though there was no kindness in my voice now. "Richard was very thorough in his final thoughts about your relationship. She continued reading, and I watched as her hands began to tremble more violently. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, and for a moment I thought she might faint right there in the funeral home. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were filled with tears, not tears of grief, but tears of humiliation and devastation. He wrote this?" she asked, her voice breaking. 2 weeks before he died," I confirmed. He was very clear-minded that day, despite the medication. He spent over an hour writing that letter, making sure every word was exactly what he wanted to say to you. He even had me read it to make sure his handwriting was legible. Sarah looked down at the letter again, then back at me, then at the letter once more. I could see her trying to process what she had just read, trying to reconcile the Richard she thought she knew with the man who had written those devastating words. "But he told me he loved me," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "He said I was the best thing that had ever happened to him. He said you didn't understand him the way I did." "Sarah," I said, leaning slightly closer so that only she could hear me, "my husband was a weak man who couldn't face his responsibilities, so he ran to you whenever life became too difficult. But he was also a coward who could never commit to anything that required real sacrifice. You were never his great love story, you were his escape room." The letter fluttered to the floor as Sarah's hands went limp, and I bent to pick it up, not wanting Richard's final words to be trampled by funeral home visitors. As I straightened, I saw that Sarah was staring at me with a mixture of hatred and despair. "You knew," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "All this time, you knew about us." "I've known for 3 years, I replied matter-of-factly. "I found out quite by accident when I was looking for a receipt in Richard's briefcase and found a hotel bill instead. Once I knew what to look for, it wasn't hard to put the pieces together." Sarah's face crumpled at my matter-of-fact tone, perhaps because it made their secret affair seem tawdry and obvious rather than romantic and mysterious. "Why didn't you confront him?" she asked desperately. "Why didn't you fight for your marriage?" I considered her question carefully before answering, because it was one I had asked myself countless times over the past 3 years. "Because I had already lost my marriage, Sarah. The moment Richard decided to seek comfort in another woman's bed instead of working through his problems with his wife, our marriage was over. I just chose to stay for the end credits instead of walking out during the movie." Around us, the funeral reception continued, people eating finger sandwiches and sharing stories about Richard's kindness and generosity. If anyone noticed the drama unfolding in our corner, they were polite enough to look away and give us privacy. "But you took care of him when he was sick," Sarah pressed, seeming desperate to understand my motivations. "You nursed him through cancer. You were there every single day. If you didn't love him anymore, why would you do that?" This question struck something deep inside me, and for the first time in our conversation, I felt my composure waver slightly. "Because that's what love looks like sometimes, Sarah. Real love isn't just the exciting parts, the passion and the romance and the stolen moments in hotel rooms. Real love is showing up when someone needs you, even when they don't deserve it. Even when they've hurt you beyond repair." I paused, looking around the room at all the people who had come to honor Richard's memory. "I didn't take care of him because I thought he would choose me over you in the end. I took care of him because 30 years of marriage and 2 children together meant something to me, even if it didn't mean enough to him. I took care of him because that's who I am, not because of who he was." Sarah was crying openly now, no longer caring who might see her emotional breakdown. "He said he was going to leave you for me after he got better. He said we would travel together, maybe move somewhere warm where we could start over fresh. He promised me that once his treatment was finished, we'd be together properly." "Sarah," I said gently, feeling an unexpected wave of pity for this woman who had believed my husband's lies for 3 years, "Richard was never going to leave me for you. Even if he had survived the cancer, even if he had lived another 30 years, he would never have chosen you over the safety and respectability of his marriage. You were his secret indulgence, not his future." She shook her head violently, as if she could deny the truth by refusing to accept it. "No, you don't understand. We had plans. We talked about buying a house together, maybe getting a dog. He showed me pictures of places in Arizona where we could retire. He said whatever he needed to say to keep you available to him," I interrupted, my voice firm but not unkind. Just like he said whatever he needed to say to keep me taking care of him at home. Richard was a man who liked to be comfortable, and he arranged his life so that all of his needs were met by different people. You met his need for excitement and validation. I met his need for stability and respectability. The truth of my words seemed to hit Sarah like a physical blow. She staggered slightly, reaching out to steady herself against the wall. "Read the letter again," I suggested, holding it out to her. "But this time, really listen to what he's saying. Don't read what you wish it said, read what it actually says." With trembling hands, Sarah took the letter back and read it again. This time, I could see understanding dawning in her eyes as she absorbed Richard's actual words instead of trying to find hidden declarations of love between the lines. The letter was brutal in its honesty. Richard had written about how their affair had started during a particularly stressful period at work, when he felt overwhelmed by responsibilities and looking for an escape from the pressures of family life. He described Sarah as convenient and uncomplicated, someone who didn't ask difficult questions or expect emotional depth from him. He admitted that he had never intended for their relationship to last as long as it did, but that he had been too comfortable with the arrangement to end it. Sarah provided easy companionship without the complexities of a real relationship, while I provided the stability and social respectability that he needed for his career and public image. Most damaging of all, Richard had written about specific intimate moments between them, but not in a romantic way. Instead, he described them clinically, almost dismissively, as if they were transactions rather than expressions of love. He wrote about Sarah's insecurities and her constant need for reassurance about her appearance and her value to him, and how exhausting he found her emotional neediness. He complained about her jealousy of me, her frequent demands for more of his time and attention, and her pressure on him to leave his marriage. "Sarah never understood that what we had was supposed to be simple," he wrote. "She kept trying to turn it into something complicated and permanent, when the whole point was that it was temporary and separate from my real life." The final paragraph was devastating. Richard wrote that Sarah had been useful for a time, but that facing his mortality had made him realize how shallow and meaningless their relationship had been. He thanked me, his wife, for my loyalty and devotion during his illness, and he specifically requested that I give Sarah this letter so that she would understand that whatever they had shared was never real and never meant to last. By the time Sarah finished reading the letter for the second time, she was sobbing so hard that several people in the room had begun to notice our conversation. I took the letter from her hands and folded it carefully, slipping it back into the envelope. "I need to leave," Sarah choked out between sobs. I can't stay here." "That's probably for the best," I agreed, though my tone was gentler now. Despite everything she had put me through, despite the pain her relationship with my husband had caused my family, I couldn't help but feel sorry for her in that moment. She had been used just as surely as I had been, just in a different way. As she started to turn away, I called her name one more time. "Sarah." She paused, looking back at me with red, swollen eyes. For what it's worth, I don't think Richard set out to hurt either of us deliberately. I think he was just a selfish man who took the easy path whenever life got difficult. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it might help you understand that this wasn't really about you or me. It was about his own weakness and inability to face his problems honestly. She nodded mutely and turned to leave, making her way quickly toward the exit. I watched her go, this woman who had haunted my marriage for 3 years, and felt something I hadn't expected, relief mixed with a strange sort of closure. The secret was out. The burden was lifted. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't have to pretend that my marriage was perfect or that my husband was faithful. I didn't have to smile and accept compliments about Richard's devotion while knowing the truth about his double life. As Sarah disappeared through the funeral home doors, I found myself surrounded by concerned friends and family members who had noticed the dramatic scene that had just unfolded. "Are you all right, dear?" asked Mrs. Henderson from our church, her aged hand resting gently on my arm. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Not a ghost," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Just a truth that needed to be told." My daughter Jessica appeared at my side, her face creased with worry and confusion. "Mom, who was that woman?" She looked upset, and people are starting to talk. I looked at Jessica, this beautiful young woman who had inherited her father's quick wit and my stubborn determination, and made a decision that would have been impossible for me an hour earlier. That was someone your father knew very well, I said simply, but with enough emphasis that Jessica would understand the implication. Someone who needed to hear something important about him that she had never been told. Jessica's eyes widened as understanding dawned, and I saw her glance quickly around the room to see if anyone else had overheard our conversation. "Mom," she said quietly, moving closer so that others couldn't overhear, "are you saying that Dad was?" "I'm saying that your father was a complicated man who made choices that affected our family in ways you never knew about," I replied carefully. "But he's gone now, and what matters is how we move forward from here with honesty and dignity." Marcus, my 25-year-old son, joined us at that moment, perhaps sensing that an important family conversation was taking place. Like his sister, he had his father's eyes but my practical nature and strong moral compass. "Is everything okay?" he asked, looking between Jessica and me with concern. "I saw some woman leaving in tears, and you looked like you were having an intense conversation with her." "Everything is going to be okay," I said, and for the first time in years, I truly believed it. "We're going to be just fine, but there are some things about your father that you both deserve to know, and I think it's time we talked about them honestly." Both of my children nodded, their faces serious but not judgmental. They were adults now, old enough to handle adult truths about their parents' marriage, and I realized that protecting them from reality hadn't been helping anyone. "Not here," Jessica said quietly, glancing around at the crowded reception room. "Maybe we should go home and talk privately." "That's probably best," I agreed. "There's a lot you both need to understand about the last few years, and some of it is going to be difficult to hear. But I'm tired of carrying secrets that aren't mine to carry, and you both deserve to know the truth about your father and our marriage." The rest of the reception passed in a blur of casseroles and condolences, but I felt different somehow, lighter, despite having just buried my husband. People continued to approach me with stories about Richard's kindness and generosity, but now I could listen to them without feeling like a fraud. Yes, Richard had been kind to many people. Yes, he had been generous with his time and resources. He had also been unfaithful to his wife and dishonest about his deepest commitments. People are complex, and death doesn't erase that complexity, it just makes us more willing to focus on the positive aspects of someone's character. That evening, after all the guests had gone home and the dishes had been washed and put away, I sat with my children in our living room and told them the truth about their father's affair. I spoke calmly and factually, without editorializing or trying to influence their feelings about Richard. I simply laid out the timeline of discovery, the evidence I had found, and the 3-year period during which I had known about Sarah while trying to preserve our family's stability. Jessica cried, not for her father's infidelity, but for the pain I had endured in silence for so long. Marcus was angry, not at me for keeping the secret, but at his father for putting me in that impossible position. Both of them expressed regret that I had felt I needed to protect them from the truth, and both assured me that they would have supported me no matter what I had decided to do. "I can't believe you carried that burden alone for 3 years, Jessica said, reaching over to take my hand. "Mom, you should have told us. We could have helped you through it. You were both starting your own lives, building your own relationships and careers," I replied. "It wasn't your burden to carry. Besides, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do about it, and I didn't want to poison your relationship with your father until I had figured out my own feelings." "Do you regret staying with him?" Marcus asked bluntly. "Do you regret not confronting him about the affair?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications about marriage, loyalty, and self-respect. I considered it carefully before answering. "I regret that your father put me in a position where I had to choose between my dignity and my family's stability," I said finally. "But I don't regret the choice I made. I'm proud of how I handled an impossible situation. I stayed because I believed our marriage was worth fighting for, even if your father didn't. I took care of him during his illness because that's what my marriage vows meant to me, even if they didn't mean the same thing to him." "But what about that woman?" Jessica asked. "What made you finally decide to confront her today?" I thought about Sarah's smirk, about the way she had enjoyed watching me grieve while believing she held some secret power over our family's legacy. "She came to your father's funeral not to pay respects, but to gloat," I said simply. She thought she had won some kind of victory, and she wanted to rub my face in it. I realized that the only power she had over me was the power I gave her by keeping Richard's secrets. Once I stopped protecting his reputation, she had nothing left. Over the next few weeks, as we settled Richard's estate and I began adjusting to life as a widow, I found myself thinking often about the conversation with Sarah. Not with regret or second-guessing, but with a sense of completion and freedom I hadn't experienced in years. The secret that had poisoned my marriage was finally out in the open, and I no longer had to carry it alone. My children knew the truth about their father, and while it had been difficult for them to hear, it had also freed them from the burden of believing in a perfect marriage that had never actually existed. More importantly, I had reclaimed my own narrative. For 3 years, I had allowed Richard's choices to define my reality, living in the shadow of his betrayal while maintaining the facade of a happy marriage. Now, finally, I was free to define myself by my own choices and values rather than by his failures. 3 months after the funeral, I received an unexpected phone call. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, I heard Sarah's voice on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Williams? This is Sarah Martinez. I hope you don't mind that I'm calling you." I was surprised to hear from her, but not entirely shocked. The letter had been devastating enough that I had wondered whether she would eventually reach out to me for some kind of closure or explanation. "What can I do for you, Sarah?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "I wanted to apologize," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "Not just for the affair, but for how I behaved at Richard's funeral. I was cruel and vindictive, and I'm ashamed of how I acted. You were grieving your husband, and I made it about my own petty jealousy and need to feel important." I listened without interrupting, curious about what had prompted this call and where she was going with her apology. "I've been seeing a therapist," she continued, trying to understand how I ended up in that situation and why I accepted being someone's secret for 3 years. Reading Richard's letter forced me to confront some things about myself that I had been avoiding. "Such as?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective on the situation. "Such as the fact that I had convinced myself I was the victim in our triangle," she said. "I told myself that you were the obstacle keeping Richard and me apart, when the truth was that Richard was using both of us to avoid having to make any real choices about what he wanted." There was a long pause, and I could hear her trying to collect herself before continuing. "I realized that I had never actually been in love with Richard," she said finally. "I was in love with the idea of being chosen, of being special, of winning some kind of competition. But I never really knew him as a person, and he never really knew me. We were just using each other to fill voids in our lives." Her insight surprised me with its clarity and honesty. This was not the same woman who had smirked at me across the funeral home. "What made you realize that?" I asked. Reading his letter over and over again, she replied. "At first, I was angry and hurt that he had described our relationship so coldly. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized he was right. We never talked about anything important. We never supported each other through difficult times. We never built anything together or worked toward common goals. All we had was the excitement of secrecy and the ego boost of being desired." She was quiet for a moment before adding, "You know what I envied most about you? Not that you were married to him, but that you actually knew him. You knew his flaws and his fears, his strengths and his weaknesses. You had a real relationship with a real person, even if that person wasn't always faithful to you. I had a fantasy relationship with an idea of a person who never really existed." Her words struck me as profoundly true, and I found myself feeling something approaching sympathy for her. "Sarah," I said gently, "I appreciate you calling, and I accept your apology. But more importantly, I hope you're learning to value yourself enough to demand honesty and commitment from the people in your life." "I am," she said with determination. "I ended another relationship 2 weeks ago because the man wanted to keep me as his secret while he figured out his situation with his ex-wife. The old me would have accepted that and hoped he would eventually choose me. The new me told him to call me when he was actually available, not just convenient." I smiled at that, proud of her for learning to respect herself enough to walk away from a situation that didn't serve her. Good for you, I said sincerely. You deserve someone who chooses you openly and completely, not someone who keeps you hidden while he sorts out his other obligations. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet house and reflected on how much had changed in the months since Richard's funeral. Sarah was learning to value herself appropriately. My children had a more realistic understanding of their parents' marriage and a deeper appreciation for honesty in relationships. And I was discovering who I was when I wasn't defined by someone else's secrets and failures. 6 months after the funeral, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable during my marriage. I started dating. His name was David Thompson, and he was a widower I met at a grief support group that my daughter had encouraged me to attend. Unlike Richard, David was completely transparent about his past, his feelings, and his intentions. He had loved his first wife deeply and missed her terribly, but he was honest about his desire for companionship and his interest in building something new rather than trying to recreate what he had lost. We took our time getting to know each other, sharing stories about our marriages, both the joys and the struggles. I told David about Richard's affair, not as a source of shame but as an important part of my history that had shaped who I had become. David listened without judgment and shared his own stories of marriage challenges and the work it had taken to build a strong relationship with his late wife. The difference between us and some people, David said one evening as we sat on my front porch watching the sunset, is that we know how hard marriage can be and how much work it takes to do it right. We're not looking for fairy tales anymore, we're looking for partnership built on truth and mutual respect. He was absolutely right. At 57, I wasn't interested in passionate romance or dramatic love stories that burned bright and fast. I wanted companionship, honesty, respect, and the kind of love that showed up every day in small, consistent ways. I wanted someone who would choose me actively and continuously, not someone who would string me along while keeping his options open. The contrast between David's approach to relationships and Richard's was startling. Where Richard had been secretive and compartmentalized, David was open and integrative. He introduced me to his friends and adult children within weeks of our first date, not because he was rushing into anything, but because he saw no reason to keep any aspect of his life hidden from me. I spent 42 years married to a woman who knew everything about me, he explained when I commented on his transparency. The good, the bad, and the embarrassing. That's what real intimacy looks like, being fully known and fully accepted. I'm too old to pretend to be someone I'm not, and too wise to want a relationship with someone who can't handle the real me. His words resonated deeply because they described everything my marriage to Richard had lacked. Richard had kept parts of himself hidden from me, not just the affair but his true feelings, his doubts, his struggles. He had presented me with a carefully curated version of himself while showing Sarah a different facet of his personality, never allowing either of us to know him completely. David, in contrast, was refreshingly whole. When he talked about his late wife, he spoke of her with love and respect, but he also acknowledged the challenges they had faced and the work they had put in to overcome them. When he talked about his fears about dating again, he was honest about his concerns without expecting me to manage his emotions for him. One evening, about 8 months after we started dating, David and I were having dinner when he brought up a conversation he had had with his financial advisor about combining our resources if our relationship continued to progress toward marriage. In my first marriage, Richard would have made these decisions alone and informed me after the fact, if he had bothered to inform me at all. David, however, wanted my input on how we should handle our potential future together and what our goals should be. I don't want to make any major decisions that would affect both of us without discussing them with you first, he said simply. If we're going to build a life together, it needs to be a partnership where both of our voices are heard and both of our needs are considered. Such a simple concept, being consulted about decisions that would affect my future, but it represented a fundamental shift in how I was valued and treated in a relationship. I was no longer someone whose job was to manage the household and ask no questions about the bigger picture. I was someone whose wisdom and perspective were sought out and respected. That night, as I lay in my own bed thinking about the conversation, I reflected on how different this felt from my marriage to Richard. With Richard, I had always felt like I was on probation, constantly working to prove my worth and earn his attention. With David, I felt valued from the beginning, not because of what I could do for him, but because of who I was as a person. It's remarkable how the same qualities can be perceived so differently by different people. With Richard, my desire for honesty and communication had been seen as nagging or neediness. With David, it was seen as wisdom and strength. With Richard, my loyalty and dedication had been taken for granted and sometimes even resented. With David, they were treasured and reciprocated. David and I married 2 years after we met, in a small ceremony attended by our children and closest friends. It wasn't the wedding of a young girl's dreams, it was the wedding of a mature woman who knew exactly what she wanted and why she wanted it. At the reception, as David and I danced to a song we had chosen together, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. I looked genuinely happy, not the forced smile I had worn like a mask during the final years of my first marriage, but the authentic contentment that comes from being fully known and completely accepted. Standing there in my second wedding dress, surrounded by people who loved me for exactly who I was, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The betrayal that had nearly broken me had ultimately freed me to understand what real love looked like. The secrets that had poisoned my first marriage had taught me to value honesty above all else. The funeral that had been one of the worst days of my life had also been the day I finally found my voice and reclaimed my power. 5 years into my marriage with David, I received another letter from Sarah. This one was different from her previous correspondence, not apologetic or seeking closure, but sharing good news and expressing gratitude. Dear Margaret, it began, I hope this letter finds you well and happy. I wanted to let you know that I got married last month to a wonderful man who knows everything about my past and loves me anyway. For the first time in my life, I'm in a relationship where I don't have to hide or minimize myself, where I'm valued for who I am rather than being convenient for what someone needs. She went on to explain that she had spent several years in therapy, not just dealing with her relationship with Richard, but examining the deeper patterns that had led her to accept being someone's secret for so many years. She had learned to recognize the difference between being chosen and being used, between being loved and being convenient. The man I married proposed to me in front of his entire extended family at Christmas dinner, she wrote. No hiding, no secrets, no shame. Just a man who was proud to claim me publicly and wanted everyone to know how much he valued me. When he got down on one knee, his mother actually cried with joy, and his sister immediately started planning an engagement party. I had never experienced being welcomed into someone's life so completely and openly. She described her husband as someone who had also learned hard lessons about the importance of honesty in relationships. His first marriage had ended because of his ex-wife's infidelity, and he was committed to building something different based on complete transparency and mutual respect. I know this might sound strange, her letter continued, but I wanted to thank you again for giving me Richard's letter that day. It was the most devastating and most necessary wake-up call I could have received. It forced me to examine why I was willing to accept so little from someone who claimed to care about me, and why I had convinced myself that being someone's secret was better than being alone. She concluded by saying that she hoped I had found the happiness and peace that I deserved, and that she would always be grateful to me for choosing truth over kindness on the day when truth was exactly what she needed to hear. I shared Sarah's letter with David, and we talked about how strange life's journey can be, how the worst experiences can sometimes lead to the most important growth, how the people who hurt us can inadvertently teach us valuable lessons about ourselves, and how truth-telling, even when it's painful, can be an act of love. Are you going to write her back? David asked. I think I will, I replied. Not to become friends, but to acknowledge that we both learned something important from that terrible situation, and that we both used those lessons to build better lives for ourselves. I did write back to Sarah, a brief note congratulating her on her marriage and expressing genuine happiness that she had found a relationship based on honesty and mutual respect. I also told her about David and how different it felt to be in a partnership where I was valued as an equal rather than managed as a dependent. It's interesting, I wrote, how Richard's betrayal ultimately led both of us to understand what we really deserved from love. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most teach us the most valuable lessons about our own worth. I ended the letter by wishing her well in her marriage and thanking her for sharing her good news. It felt appropriate to end that chapter of our shared history on a positive note, acknowledging that all of us, Richard, Sarah, and I, had ultimately been freed from the unhealthy dynamic that had defined our relationship for so long. Now, at 62 years old, married to David for 5 years, I can look back on the morning of Richard's funeral with something approaching gratitude. Not gratitude for the pain or the betrayal or the years of deception, but gratitude for the strength I discovered within myself when I was forced to confront the truth about my life and make choices based on my own values rather than other people's expectations. The woman who stood in that funeral home and handed a devastating letter to her husband's mistress was someone I hadn't known I could be, someone who could face uncomfortable truths without flinching, speak difficult words without cruelty, and maintain her dignity even in the midst of public revelation. That woman had been inside me all along, waiting for the circumstances that would call her forth. Sarah's smirk had been the catalyst, but the strength had been mine from the beginning. Last year, David and I were attending a charity dinner when I spotted a familiar face across the room. It was Sarah, now married and apparently happy, standing next to a tall man who kept his arm around her waist in a casually possessive but respectful way. She saw me at the same moment I saw her, and for a split second, I wondered if the evening would become awkward. Instead, Sarah approached our table with her husband in tow, her face showing none of the defiance or shame that had characterized our previous encounters. "Margaret," she said warmly, "I'd like you to meet my husband, James. James, this is Margaret Thompson, someone who played a very important role in helping me understand what I deserved from love." James shook my hand with genuine warmth and said, "Sarah has told me about you. Thank you for being honest with her when honesty was exactly what she needed, even though it would have been easier to stay silent." We chatted briefly about our respective marriages and how we had both found happiness with partners who valued honesty and commitment. There was no awkwardness or lingering resentment, just two women who had survived a difficult situation and used it as a foundation for building better lives. As they walked away, David turned to me with a questioning look. "Old friend?" he asked. "Something like that," I replied. "Someone who learned an important lesson the hard way, just like I did." "Good for both of you," he said simply, and that was the end of the conversation. No jealousy, no need for detailed explanations, no insecurity about my past. Just acceptance and trust, the foundation of a healthy relationship. That encounter reinforced something I had come to understand about forgiveness and healing. They don't require ongoing relationships with the people who hurt us, but they do require us to release the hold that past pain has on our present happiness. Sarah and I would never be close friends, but we were no longer enemies either. We were simply two women who had been caught in the web of one man's inability to be honest about his needs and desires, and who had both chosen to use that painful experience as a catalyst for positive change. If you've ever had to find strength you didn't know you possessed during your darkest moments, share your story in the comments. Sometimes our most difficult experiences reveal our most powerful capabilities, and recognizing that power can change everything about how we see ourselves and what we're willing to accept in our lives. Today, when I think about that gray morning 9 years ago, I don't focus on the pain or the betrayal or even the satisfaction of watching Sarah's face crumble as she read Richard's letter. Instead, I think about the moment when I made the choice to speak the truth instead of protecting everyone else from it. That moment changed everything. It changed how I saw myself, how I related to others, and what I was willing to accept in the name of love. It taught me that real strength isn't about enduring pain silently, it's about speaking truth courageously, even when that truth disrupts the comfortable lies that everyone has agreed to believe. Richard's mistress smirked at me that day because she thought she held all the power in our twisted triangle. But power built on deception is ultimately powerless against someone who is willing to speak the truth, regardless of the consequences. And the truth, as painful as it was for all of us to hear, set every single one of us free. Standing here now, in a marriage built on honesty and mutual respect, surrounded by children and grandchildren who see me as a whole person rather than just a caretaker, I can say with complete certainty that handing Sarah that letter was one of the best decisions I ever made. Not because it hurt her, I take no pleasure in that pain, even now. But because it finally allowed all of us to stop living in the shadow of Richard's lies and start building lives based on truth and authentic love. The truth doesn't always set you free immediately, but it always sets you free eventually. And freedom, even when it comes at a high price, is always worth the cost. 6 months ago, I decided to do something that would have been impossible during my first marriage. I started writing a book about my experience. Not a tell-all designed to embarrass anyone, but an honest exploration of how to rebuild your life after betrayal, how to recognize your own worth when someone you trusted has made you question it, and how to find the courage to speak truth in situations where everyone else is invested in maintaining comfortable lies. The process of writing has been both healing and empowering. It has forced me to examine not just what happened to me, but how I chose to respond to what happened, and how those choices shaped the person I became. David has been incredibly supportive of the project, reading chapters as I complete them and offering insights from his own experience of loss and rebuilding. His encouragement has been invaluable, but even more important has been his complete lack of jealousy or insecurity about my past. He understands that my experiences with Richard, painful as they were, are part of what made me the woman he fell in love with. "Your strength didn't come from nowhere," he said when I worried that writing about the affair might be uncomfortable for him. "It came from surviving something that would have destroyed a weaker person." I'm proud to be married to someone who turned her worst experience into wisdom that can help other people. My book is scheduled to be published next year, and I've already received letters from women who heard about it through my publisher. They're women who are living with unfaithful husbands, women who are carrying secrets that are slowly poisoning their lives, women who are struggling to understand their own worth in relationships that diminish them. One letter particularly moved me. It was from a 43-year-old woman named Linda who had discovered her husband's affair 2 years ago and had been paralyzed by indecision ever since. "I know I should confront him or leave," she wrote, "but I keep hoping that if I just ignore it long enough, it will go away on its own. Reading about your experience makes me realize that I'm not protecting anyone by keeping his secret, I'm just enabling his dishonesty and sacrificing my own peace of mind." I wrote back to Linda, sharing some of the lessons I had learned about the difference between protecting your family and protecting someone from the consequences of their choices. I encouraged her to seek counseling, both individually and with her husband if he was willing, and to remember that staying in a marriage should be a choice made from strength and hope, not from fear and desperation. "Whatever you decide to do," I told her, "make sure it's a decision you can live with long term, not just a temporary fix that avoids immediate discomfort. You deserve to be in a relationship where you can trust your partner completely, and if that's not possible in your current marriage, it may be time to consider whether you'd be happier building something new with someone who values honesty as much as you do." Her situation reminded me of my own struggle 3 years earlier, when I had to decide whether to confront Richard about his affair or continue carrying the burden of his secret. At the time, I had chosen to stay silent because I believed it was the best decision for my family. Looking back, I understand that it was also the decision that required the least immediate change and disruption. But change and disruption aren't always bad things. Sometimes they're necessary for growth and healing. Sometimes they're the only path to a better future. The morning of Richard's funeral, when I handed Sarah that letter, I chose disruption over silence, truth over comfortable lies. It was one of the hardest things I had ever done, but it was also one of the most important. It marked the beginning of my journey toward authentic happiness rather than the careful management of an unsustainable situation. Now, as I finish writing this story, I want to leave you with the most important lesson I learned from that experience. You are more resilient than you think, more valuable than you've been told, and more capable of change than you've allowed yourself to believe. The woman who stood in that funeral home 9 years ago, facing down her husband's mistress with quiet dignity and devastating honesty, was always inside me. She was just waiting for the moment when staying silent became more painful than speaking the truth. That moment will come for you too, if it hasn't already. When it does, remember that you have the strength to handle whatever consequences your honesty brings. You have the wisdom to rebuild your life on a foundation of truth rather than comfortable lies. And you have the value to demand relationships that honor and respect who you really are, not just what you can provide for someone else. Richard's mistress smirked at me that day because she thought she understood the power dynamics in our relationship. She was wrong. The real power belonged to the person who was willing to tell the truth, face the consequences, and build something better from the ashes of what had been destroyed. That person was me. That person is you too, when you're ready to claim it. Remember to subscribe if you want to hear more stories about finding strength in impossible situations, and write in the comments about a time when telling the truth changed your life forever. Sometimes the most difficult conversations lead to the most important transformations, and your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find their own courage. The truth will set you free. It might hurt first, it might be complicated, and it might require you to rebuild parts of your life that you thought were stable. But it will set you free, and freedom is always worth fighting for. 3 years after my book was published, something unexpected happened that brought my story full circle in a way I never could have anticipated. I was at a bookstore signing copies when a young woman approached my table with tears in her eyes and a well-worn copy of my book in her hands. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, her voice shaking, "my name is Ashley Martinez, and I think you knew my mother." I looked up at her more carefully, and the resemblance was unmistakable. She had Sarah's blonde hair and delicate features, but her eyes held a wisdom and strength that reminded me of myself at that age. "Sarah is your mother?" I asked gently, setting down my pen to give her my full attention. "Yes," Ashley nodded, wiping away tears. "She died 6 months ago. Cancer, just like your first husband. But before she died, she made me promise to find you and thank you for something that happened many years ago." My heart clenched with unexpected grief. Despite everything that had passed between Sarah and me, the news of her death hit me harder than I would have expected. "I'm so sorry for your loss," I said sincerely. "Your mother was a complicated person who made some difficult choices, but she learned from her mistakes and built a good life for herself afterward. You should be proud of the woman she became." Ashley smiled through her tears. "She talked about you often, especially during her final weeks. She said you were the person who taught her the difference between being loved and being used, and that lesson changed the entire trajectory of her life." She pulled out a sealed envelope from her purse, similar to the one I had given Sarah at Richard's funeral all those years ago. "She wrote this letter for you before she died," Ashley explained. "She said it was important that you know how your courage that day at the funeral home had rippled out to affect not just her life, but mine and my children's lives too." I took the envelope with trembling hands, remembering the last time I had been the recipient of such a message rather than the deliverer. "Would you like me to read it now?" I asked. "If you don't mind," Ashley replied. "She specifically asked me to be present when you read it, so I could answer any questions you might have about her life after that day." I opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Sarah's handwriting was shakier than I remembered, evidence of her illness, but her words were clear and strong. "Dear Margaret," the letter began, "I am writing this knowing that I don't have much time left, and I want to make sure you understand the full impact of your decision to give me Richard's letter that day at his funeral. At the time, it felt like the cruelest thing anyone had ever done to me. Now, as I prepare to meet my maker, I realize it was the kindest." The letter went on to describe how reading Richard's brutal assessment of their relationship had forced Sarah to examine not just that affair, but the pattern of relationships she had chosen throughout her adult life. She had realized that she had been attracted to unavailable men because they felt safe. They couldn't really reject her if they were never fully available to begin with. "But you showed me that being someone's secret isn't protection from rejection, it's rejection disguised as acceptance," she wrote. Richard's letter made me see that he had rejected me from the very beginning by refusing to give me a place in his real life. I had been living on scraps and convincing myself it was a feast. Sarah described the years of therapy that had followed, the painful process of learning to value herself enough to demand honesty and commitment from potential partners. She had met James 2 years after Richard's funeral, and she had almost walked away from him when he expressed genuine interest in a real relationship. "I was so used to men who kept me at arm's length that when James wanted to introduce me to his family after our 3rd date, I panicked," she wrote. "I actually broke up with him because I thought there must be something wrong with a man who wanted to claim me publicly." It took months of therapy to realize that healthy men don't keep good women secret. The letter revealed details about Sarah's life that I had never known. She had grown up in a home where her father had multiple affairs, watching her mother pretend not to know while slowly dying inside from the betrayal. Sarah had unconsciously sought out similar dynamics in her own relationships, choosing men who would recreate the familiar pattern of being loved, sometimes, rather than all the time. When I finally got the courage to call James and explain why I had pushed him away, she continued, "He said something that changed my life forever. He said, 'Sarah, you're not asking me to love you despite your flaws. You're asking me to love you despite your strengths. Stop apologizing for being worth loving completely.'" The letter described their marriage, the birth of Ashley, and the conscious decision they had made to build their family on complete honesty and transparency. Sarah had told Ashley age-appropriate versions of her story as she grew up, not to shame herself, but to teach her daughter about healthy relationships and the importance of knowing your own worth. Ashley has never settled for being anyone's secret, Sarah wrote with obvious pride. She married a man who adores her openly and treats her like the treasure she is. My granddaughters are growing up knowing they deserve nothing less than complete devotion and honesty from the people who claim to love them. The final paragraph brought tears to my eyes. Margaret, I know you probably think you were just protecting yourself and your family that day when you gave me Richard's letter. But you were also protecting me, though neither of us realized it at the time. You saved me from a lifetime of accepting crumbs when I deserved the whole loaf. You taught me that truth, however painful, is always better than comfortable lies. Because of your courage, I was able to teach my daughter and granddaughters the same lesson. The ripple effects of your strength have touched generations. I folded the letter carefully, my hands shaking slightly. Around us, the bookstore continued its normal activity, but I felt as though Ashley and I were in our own private bubble of shared grief and understanding. Your mother was an extraordinary woman, I said finally. It takes tremendous courage to examine your own patterns and choose to change them. Most people would have just blamed me or Richard or circumstances, but she took responsibility for her own healing. She said you would understand that, Ashley smiled. She told me that you were the first person she ever met who held her accountable for her choices without condemning her as a person. She said that distinction made all the difference in how she was able to process what happened. We talked for another hour about Sarah's life, her marriage to James, and her determination to break the cycle of dysfunction that had affected her family for generations. Ashley shared stories about her mother's volunteer work with women leaving abusive relationships, and how Sarah had used her own experience to help others recognize the difference between love and manipulation. She always said that the women she helped were braver than she had been, Ashley explained, because they were choosing to leave unhealthy situations instead of staying in them for years like she did. But I think she was pretty brave too, to completely rebuild her understanding of love at the age of 42. As Ashley prepared to leave, she pulled out one more item from her purse, a small framed photo of Sarah with her family. She asked me to give you this, Ashley said. She wanted you to see what your truth-telling had helped her build. That's James, and that's me, and those are her granddaughters, Emma and Claire. She called them her legacy of truth, because they would grow up in a family where honesty was valued above comfort. I looked at the photo and saw Sarah as I had never seen her before, genuinely happy, surrounded by people who clearly adored her, her face free of the desperate need for validation that had characterized our previous interactions. She looked peaceful, content, fulfilled in a way that had nothing to do with being chosen over someone else and everything to do with being valued for who she truly was. Thank you for sharing this with me, I said, accepting the photo. Your mother's story is proof that people can change, that mistakes don't have to define us, and that even the most painful experiences can become the foundation for something beautiful. After Ashley left, I sat in my car in the bookstore parking lot for a long time, processing what I had just learned. I thought about the woman who had smirked at me across Richard's funeral home, and the woman who had died surrounded by people who loved her completely and honestly. They were the same person, but also completely different, transformed by the decision to face truth instead of running from it. I drove home and found David in his study, reading quietly. When I told him about my encounter with Ashley and shared Sarah's final letter, he listened with the same patient attention he always gave to the parts of my story that predated our relationship. It sounds like she became the person she was always meant to be, he said thoughtfully. Sometimes we need someone else to show us our potential before we can see it ourselves. I never thought of myself as showing her potential, I replied. I thought I was just refusing to enable Richard's lies anymore. Maybe that's the same thing, David suggested. When you refuse to participate in someone's deception, you're essentially saying that you believe they're capable of handling the truth. That can be a form of faith in their strength, even when they don't have faith in themselves. His words made me think about all the other people who had been affected by my decision to speak the truth that day. My children had learned that authentic relationships were possible and worth fighting for. Sarah had learned to demand honesty and build a healthy family. Ashley and her daughters were growing up with a realistic understanding of what love should look like. Even Richard, in his final weeks, had experienced the relief of not having to maintain his exhausting double life. The ripple effects of truth-telling are often impossible to predict, but they tend to spread much further than we imagine. One moment of courage can change not just our own lives, but the lives of people we may never even meet. That evening, I called my daughter Jessica to tell her about my encounter with Ashley. Jessica was now 43, married to a wonderful man named Paul, and the mother of my 2 teenage granddaughters. "Mom," she said after I finished the story, "I hope you realize how proud I am of the choice you made that day. Growing up, I always admired your strength, but I didn't fully understand it until I got married and realized how hard it would be to confront Paul if I discovered he was being unfaithful. Have you had to face that situation?" I asked, concerned. "No," she laughed. "Paul is as transparent as glass, just like David. But I've had friends go through it, and I've watched them struggle with the same decision you faced. Some of them have chosen to look the other way, and some have chosen to confront the truth. The ones who choose truth, even when it's painful, always end up in a better place eventually." She paused before adding, "I want Emma and Sophie to know that they have a grandmother who chose truth over comfort, and that they come from a long line of strong women who don't accept less than they deserve. Your courage that day became part of our family's legacy." Her words reminded me of something Sarah had written in her final letter about the generational impact of our choices. The lessons we teach our children about what to accept in relationships don't just affect them, they affect their children and their children's children. By refusing to normalize dishonesty and betrayal, we give future generations permission to demand better. 2 weeks later, I received another unexpected visitor. This time it was a woman named Patricia who had read my book and driven 3 hours to meet me. "Mrs. Thompson," she said when I answered my door, "I know this is presumptuous, but I had to come see you. I've been married for 25 years to a man who has been unfaithful multiple times, and I keep forgiving him and trying to make it work. Reading your book made me realize that I'm not being loyal, I'm being an enabler." I invited Patricia in, and over coffee, she told me her story. Her husband David, not my David, but another man with the same name, was a successful businessman who traveled frequently and had affairs in multiple cities. Patricia had discovered evidence of his infidelity at least 5 times over the years, but each time she had chosen to forgive him and try to rebuild their marriage. "He always promises it will never happen again," she explained. "He cries and apologizes and buys me expensive gifts and goes to counseling for a few months. But then it always happens again. I keep thinking that if I just love him enough, if I just forgive him enough, he'll finally change." I listened to her story with a heavy heart, recognizing the trap she had fallen into, the belief that her love and forgiveness could transform someone who didn't want to be transformed. "Patricia," I said gently, "you can't love someone into being faithful. Fidelity isn't something you inspire in someone else, it's something they choose for themselves. If your husband wanted to be faithful, he would be. The fact that he keeps choosing to betray you tells you everything you need to know about his priorities." "But what about our children?" she asked. "What about our financial security? What about all the years we've invested in this marriage?" These were the same questions I had asked myself during those 3 years when I knew about Richard's affair but chose to stay silent. I understood the paralysis that comes from having so much invested in a situation that isn't working. "Those are all valid concerns," I acknowledged. "But ask yourself this: what are you teaching your children about what they should accept in their own relationships? Are you showing them that love means accepting betrayal? Are you demonstrating that marriage vows are optional for men but binding for women?" Patricia started crying, and I handed her a box of tissues while she processed the implications of my questions. "I never thought about it that way," she said finally. "My daughter is 16, and she's starting to date. What am I teaching her about how men should treat her?" "You're teaching her whatever you're willing to accept," I replied honestly. "Children learn more from what we do than from what we say. If you accept betrayal and disrespect, she'll learn that those are normal parts of love." We talked for another hour about her options, the practical considerations of potentially ending her marriage, and the resources available to help her make whatever decision felt right for her situation. I didn't try to convince her to leave her husband, that wasn't my place, but I did try to help her see that staying should be a choice made from strength and hope, not from fear and resignation. "Whatever you decide," I told her as she prepared to leave, "make sure it's a decision you can live with long term. Don't just choose what's easiest in the moment, choose what's best for your future self and your daughter's understanding of what she deserves from love. 6 months later, Patricia sent me a card letting me know that she had decided to separate from her husband and was in the process of filing for divorce. "It's the hardest thing I've ever done," she wrote, "but it's also the most empowering. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm living according to my own values instead of managing someone else's failures." These encounters, with Ashley, with Patricia, with the countless other women who have reached out to me after reading my book, have shown me that the moment I handed Sarah that letter at Richard's funeral was more significant than I could have imagined at the time. It wasn't just about ending Richard's deception or confronting his mistress, it was about choosing truth as a way of life, and that choice has influenced more people than I ever expected. Now, at 65, married to David for 8 years and surrounded by children and grandchildren who understand the importance of honesty in relationships, I can see the full scope of what happened that gray morning so long ago. Richard's mistress smirked at me because she thought she understood the power dynamics between us. She thought she had won some kind of victory by sharing my husband's bed while I managed his household and reputation. But real power doesn't come from what you can take from someone else, it comes from your willingness to speak truth, face consequences, and build something authentic from whatever remains after the lies have been stripped away. Real power comes from refusing to participate in other people's deceptions, even when that refusal costs you comfort and security. The woman who handed that letter to Sarah was claiming a power she had forgotten she possessed, the power to refuse to carry someone else's secrets, the power to demand truth in her relationships, the power to choose dignity over convenience. That power was always mine to claim, I just needed the right circumstances to remember it existed. If you've ever found yourself in a situation where you had to choose between truth and comfort, between dignity and convenience, between what was right and what was easy, you understand the weight of that choice. It's never simple, it's never painless, and it's never guaranteed to work out the way you hope. But it's always worth making, because truth has a power that lies can never match, the power to set you free, to heal what can be healed, and to clear the way for something better to take root in the space where deception used to grow. Richard's mistress smirked at me that day, believing she held all the cards. But the person with the most power in any relationship is the person who refuses to accept less than they deserve, and the person with the most freedom is the person who isn't afraid to speak the truth, regardless of the consequences. That person was me then. That person is me now. And that person can be you too, whenever you're ready to claim that power and step into that freedom. The truth will set you free. It might shake your world first, it might force you to rebuild parts of your life that you thought were solid, and it might require you to be stronger than you ever imagined you could be. But it will set you free, and freedom, real, authentic, dignified freedom, is always worth fighting for. Remember to subscribe if stories like this resonate with you, and share in the comments a time when choosing truth over comfort changed your life. Sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the most beautiful transformations, and your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find their own courage to speak their truth.